It has been so interesting talking to our Tennesseans as they have faced these issues that we have with coronavirus and what is happening, our response to it, and how we're going to fight. And yes, we're going to win this war and we're going to defeat this, but we have to look at it as our health, food, and financial assistance. And a couple of my Tennesseans last night, as we were talking and discussing this, what their thoughts and their questions to me went to is the relationship that we have with China. And how can we trust that we know what China knew, that we know when they knew it, and their lack of transparency around what happened with COVID-19. Now, as we've gotten a couple of months past the start of this, really these questions are unanswered. And as I was telling our Tennesseans on the phone last night, even as this virus that came out of Wuhan, China, they had it in December, it has now touched 6 continents, and we know that people are dealing with containment, they're dealing with mitigation, they're dealing with going through the process of getting the antivirals, getting the vaccines that are necessary to deal with COVID-19. And the questions that people have around this are compounded by the growing realization of how China has chosen not to be honest and not to be transparent in their dealings with the rest of the world. The way Beijing handled its initial response to the coronavirus was nothing new. In fact, deflection and lies meant to protect the Communist Party is part of their standard operating procedure. They have defied norms governing the protection of human rights. They embrace innovation by incursion, defy property rights, and steal intellectual property as a matter of course. We have U.S. companies that have suffered for decades by what China has done to steal their intellectual property, to infringe on their intellectual property. They defy the sovereignty of other nations and territories, and they defy what should be their role as a leader in the global economy. Certainly they want to be a market economy, or so they say, but look at their behavior. And it is this act of defiance that makes them just incredibly dangerous. And I have to tell you, this has been something that's been going on for quite a while. But we only need to go back a decade to place a flag marking our awareness of what has become a very familiar story. And over the decades, as China started to manufacture and started to pull U.S. manufacturers there, and then started to mistreat their intellectual property rights, people became aware of what was going on. And it was right at 10 years ago, when I was a member in the House, that we were doing much of the same work that we are doing right now in the U.S. Senate. We were preparing a defense authorization bill. And, Mr. President, even then, we realized the threat that China and Chinese state-owned companies posed to our national security. We drafted amendments to that year's NDAA blocking the purchase of Huawei-supplied equipment. Indeed, we're still hearing about the need to block the purchase of Huawei equipment, not only for us, but for our allies. Now, That action was 10 years ago, but China's influence has continued to grow. What we have done is pretty much our part here in the Senate to expose those bad actions, even as the rest of the world has allowed Beijing to co-opt the trappings of capitalism to perpetuate totalitarianism. Last year, we saw the people of Hong Kong rise up on behalf of democracy and self-determination. Indeed, to this day, that fight goes on, even though the threats and fears of COVID-19 have caused those protesters to have to protest in a different way. I co-sponsored the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act and sponsored legislation prohibiting the commercial export of covered munition items to the Hong Kong police force. But the world moves on even as that standoff in Hong Kong continues. The Senate was forced to pen a resolution asking the International Olympic Committee to rebid the 2022 Winter Games to a country that respects human rights. Really quite a bold move, and it leads me to wonder, why was China given this honor in the first place? And I have to tell you, nobody seems to really know the answer to that question. The aggression that they display toward Taiwan and Tibet, and the outright repression of the Uyghurs, this is something that has gone unchecked, and many times it is due to fear of economic retaliation. I've addressed this body several times on the subject of Huawei and China's leveraging of the impending 5G rollout to create national security vulnerabilities in our network. Their efforts to undermine our sovereignty are not limited to high-tech espionage. Indeed, their goal is to place their equipment, that's why it is so incredibly affordable to so many countries and so many of our allies. And in placing this equipment, what are they seeking to do, Mr. President? They are seeking to establish their own high-tech cyber spy network. We know what they're up to. This month, I introduced a bill to temper the influence of China-backed Confucius Institutes on American college campuses. We've all read the stories lately of how they have infiltrated some of our institutions of higher learning, how they have co-opted some of the staff or professors. This is something that needs our attention, and it's followed on the heels of the Stop Higher Education Espionage and Theft Act, another effort to prevent Beijing from increasing its hold on the minds of our younger generations. Time and again, we have called Chinese tech companies like TikTok. We've called them on the carpet for their censorship, their data collection, and their privacy practices, or lack of privacy, we should say. Yet content from their popular apps still dominates social media headlines. China's hold on the global economy has never been more apparent, and now there are reports that Beijing used the media and keyword censorship to suppress information about the coronavirus. And yet, Beijing remains defiant, attacking President Trump in tweets and accusing everyday Americans of racism for daring to suggest that COVID-19 originated in where? Wuhan, China. They are, as many younger people like to say, they're gaslighting us, and it's madness. So it brings us to ask, when will enough be enough? We must not let our present concerns about the response to coronavirus deter us from thinking long-term. This pandemic will change our relationship with China in every single way. It is inevitable. Starting now, we must take advantage of this knowledge. As we think about an exit strategy from the coronavirus crisis, we have to think about this. As we think about a way forward to bring manufacturing back to the United States, we need to remember this. I've spoken several times about the vulnerabilities in our pharmaceutical supply chain, and again encourage my colleagues to support the bipartisan Securing America's Medicine Cabinet, or SAMC Act, which I'm sponsoring alongside my colleague from New Jersey, Senator Menendez. Without intervention, the FDA expects the pharmaceutical industry will continue to rely on Chinese companies to make the active pharmaceutical ingredients, or the APIs, that are necessary for so many of our prescription and over-the-counter drugs. This threat it poses to our supply chain is real. On February 27, 2020, the FDA announced the shortage of one drug that is used to treat patients with coronavirus. They attributed the shortage to difficulties obtaining the API from a site in where? China. That site has been affected by, guess what? Coronavirus. We do not need to remain vulnerable. We need to realize that we are dealing with someone who has not been transparent. They have hidden information from us. They are causing shortages of drugs and vaccines and antibiotics. And it is time for us to learn from these lessons. If we ignore them, we will do so at our own peril. I yield the floor.